Thanks, Cam. I'm talking about the rocks, so I've got my rock clothes on. We've got 500 million years of rocks to get through, so I can only talk about what's important and relevant to exploration. There's too much to go through otherwise. So 20-minute talk in 3 parts, a little bit of the regional framework for the rocks to cover off from Ross, then the 3 main rock units of interest, and as an easy framework to remember them, there's 3 sandstone sandwiches, and then there's the implications for exploration to quickly wrap up. So the regional framework for the rocks. Now, in case you fall asleep and you get woken up by the applause in 20 minutes, remember this slide. This is the important framework for your exploration. There's 3 quartz sandstone sandwiches that cover off all the rocks. The first one at the bottom is the basement, because we'll work from oldest to youngest, because that's how they stack on top of each other. This is the Cambrian basement with the Stavely volcanic andesites. That's the target. This is tasty. The volcanics can host the massive sulphides, and as we've said, the porphyries can be associated with these granites. The next thing is a cover sequence, the Grampians, but it's crunchy. Beware this, it's actually hard rock in its own right. You could be exploring in here and think you're in the Cambrian basement. And what makes that more difficult is the granites that come through here have come through the same fertile metalliferous basement, and so they've actually got weak mineralisation associated with them, and you could be thinking you're chasing a Cambrian porphyry, but you're actually chasing a Devonian mineralisation event. Last on top, young cover, thin and everywhere, it's soggy, it's free-flowing, unconsolidated rocks, potentially impediments to exploration from geochem traps because it's carbonaceous, and there's also regional groundwater aquifers that can disperse geochemistry, and that can be useful. So, lunchtime memory trigger. It's the smashed avocado you want. It can actually help pay your mortgage off. So as I said, Cambrian age gives lots of time for cover, and the bedrock is only exposed in 3% of the area. Each area has prospects in it already, so there's no reason to think the other 97% wouldn't have prospects either. Nothing special about the covered bits, it's just sort of random chance. The Grampians in the middle, it's the hard rock cover, so it's poking out in the air as the Grampians National Park. For once, the National Park is the barren cover, not the mineralised area you want to look for. That's got to be a good omen. And then the entire rest of the area is the thin, soggy, young cover of basins, a couple of 100 metres thick, generally transparent and easy to drill through. In the south, this pinky colour here is a very thin sheet of newer volcanics, a bit more difficult to drill through, and they can impede looking through the magnetics, but it's not impossible. The Arc's the target. It's been known about. First deposits were drilled in almost 50 years ago now. The Geological Survey even wrote this report in the 1980s trying to get people interested, but not much happened. Why was that? Geology is a globally competitive industry. As Ross was saying, there wasn't a lot of geological context for the big picture. There's no artisanal historic mining here. The limited drilling that was done was quite shallow and tended to hit distal propylitic rather than your higher grade, more proximal potassic. So at that stage around the world, in your global market, the world's your oyster, you had the Philippines and the Andes, much better known systems. What's changed our mind now is new insights incite new exploration. And what kicked it off in the mid-2000s for us to come back and look at, as Ross has spoken, was led by the geochemistry model suggesting that the andesites had a subduction geochemistry allowing to draw cartoons like that. There's a geochemist in the audience, Tony Crawford, very good. He warned me about geochemistry. He said it can be ambiguous from inheritance and contamination, fractionation. So use your geochemistry the same way that a drunk man uses a lamppost. And what he means by that is for support rather than illumination. So don't do your whole model around the geochemistry, use it for support. So the geochemistry is supporting this model. The other thing that Ross has talked about is there's 2 metamorphic complexes either side with a paired asymmetry that also suggests subduction from the Melbourne Uni guys. That's further support. But what I think was really illuminating was when we collected the seismic across here. Because rather than just drawing cartoons, we can actually draw a cross-section. And for geologists, that's really important. You can balance it all out. And what we see in the cross-section looks like this arc edifice below with thrust belts bringing it to the surface for us, and then 2 regions with quite different geology and metamorphic zones on either side. So it's all matching, all giving us new confidence now to have another look at this region. And even before we understood all that, back in the 1970s, when we put the first geological zonation map of Victoria together just based on distinctive rock packages, we had the Glenelg, Stavely and Stall zones, and the boundaries were put in the right place way back in the 1970s because it's so distinctive. So for explorers looking for the Stavely Arc, that's great news, because on either side, we've had these high-grade metamorphics come to the surface, but you want the low-grade rocks in the middle. So here's the Stavely rocks, as Ross was saying, pristine, hardly deformed, hardly metamorphosed. These rocks are on the point of melting. If you drill down chasing the arc and you get some high-grade metamorphics like this, step away from the metamorphics, head back into the arc. Otherwise you'll be exploring for the wrong system, a different system. Okay, so you're looking for the rocks. Let's go have a quick look through them. The three sandwiches again. I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the Stavely, the basement rocks here, because that's where the main mineralisation is. So the exposure is very poor. So the best way is to strip all the cover off using magnetics, because most of the cover is transparent, and all the arc fragments of the volcanics themselves are magnetic, so we can easily pick them. And then there's all these bland sedimentary panels either side. They're also intruded by granites, and there's two sets of them. It's important that you know the difference. The Cambrian ones that can be related with the porphyries tend to be round blobs, and the Devonian ones tend to be east-west orientated, and this is all built into the 3D model. So, and what you can see we did here is most of the new drilling was into arc fragments to try and build and expand on the chemistry set. What I'm going to talk about first is the bland sedimentary panels and the magnetics either side, and there's two packages. There's what we call the Nargoon group in the west, and the rest of it is all the Glen Thompson sandstone in between. This is one of the breakthroughs from the project. At first, before we started this project, the Glen Thompson sandstone was a formation inside the Nargoon group, but based on the detrital zircons and the fact that these rocks are also intruded by morb-like dikes, exactly the same as the Kanmantoo group in South Australia, it makes a better correlation that these are earlier, from about maybe 520 down to 500 million years, and then the arcs erupted through them. The Nargoon group has a different shallow cross-bedded facies rather than turbidite, so we always had it as a sort of different rock package, but we didn't know it was also age different. Now they're really different as well when you look at the chemistry of the rocks. So we were looking at this is just all in the mudstones, we're looking at trying to get a better handle on metamorphism by looking at the shale crystallinity, and in the process of doing that you have to check what your mineralogy is, so make sure it's not all detrital. And what happened was the Nargoon group is full of chlorite and plagioclase, like from a volcanic source, whereas the Glen Thompson sandstone is full of quartz and mica, a classic continental source. So those two rocks are very, very different in the mineralogy, reflecting different sources. And the Nargoon group, it's actually got a bit of detrital, amphibole and garnet as well, which is quite calcic, like the metamorphics of Geologcal zone that are just to the west. So the best interpretation for this young package is it's a late synorogenic deposit that's getting eroded off the overthrusting Geologcal zone, depositing in the footwall and then getting immediately deformed. Whereas the Glen Thompson's a much older, long-lived system, and it's part of the Kanmantoo group with its own mineralisation history as well. This is so obviously different in the chemistry that you look at with an XRD, that you can actually pick it with a high logger as well. So if you're exploring in the future, even if you've just got little rock chips and you're doing something like a high logger, you can pick your rocks. I've colour-coded the mineralogies the same for you here. You can see all the chlorites turning up here, and in these ones it's all the yellow quartz. So you can still figure out which rock you're looking at using modern techniques, whereas to your eye it's just going to be some muddy crud. Okay, the volcanic belts. The chemistry is here pivotal. There's a whole stack of complicated belts that we can restore, and Ross has been leading on that. The important thing with most of the new drillings, it shows that all the belts have this associated calc-alkaline chemistry. Some of the people will talk more about this afternoon. So even though it's complicated now as thrust belts to the surface, we know ultimately they must have all restored down to a single flat-lying arc system in a submarine environment originally. And that's the time when the VMS is formed. So complex now, but originally much simpler. This is about as good as the outcrop gets. This is the little WILLAURA window where it's been popped up by newer tectonics through the cover so you can walk around and see bedrock at the surface. This is the type locality of the Fairview andesitic breccia. This is Mount Stavely in the background, and in the far background there's the Grampians cover over the top. Really hard field mapping volcanic sequences because a lot of the naming chemistry of the rock, whether it's the basalt or andesite, is locked up in fine-grained glass that's microscopic. So you sort of need to rely on petrography and or even more so geochemistry. You can't sort of field map. You pick it up and go, oh yeah, sort of mafic intermediate, that's about as good as it gets. So this is the sort of rocks we see here. There's sills, there's volcanic breccias where it's auto-brecciating on the seafloor, coming up, chilling, the carapace is falling off, it's erupting over itself over time. And then we've got layered rocks with grading in this subaqueous environment. When you look at the thin sections, very low grade, hardly altered. The only place where these rocks have been given names is in that window I showed where it's popped up with the type localities. There's a little bit of context here. There's the map done in the 80s by the survey. This is the volcanic belt, and these are the panels of sediments around either side, and the Bushy Creek granite intruding next door. In this area, George Buckland did about 800 thin sections, so he could work out some patches. In the west half of the Stavely belt, it was more basaltic, and this is what he called the Fairview andesitic breccia and the Nanopanda tuff basaltic andesites. On the east half of the belt, they were more felsic, and he called them the Nara, Pamela lava and the Tonoe tuff, great names. But the relationship between the felsic and the mafic package, we don't know if there's more than one cycle and which one's older or younger because the facing's not really well determined here. And the other interesting thing is between those two packages, there's this Williamson Road serpentinite, an exotic thrust cutting up through it. So the relationships are all thrusted and the margins are also thrusted as well. And there's also this black shale horizon here that could be in situ, but tends to look like it's also thrust in as potentially exotic. The dating, the historic dating was sort of potassium argine and a little bit of zircon work. And it basically showed that the Mount Stavely volcanics are about 500-ish with quite large errors. And the Bushy Creek granite looks like it's intruded later as post-tectonic, sort of had overlapped ages. So everything about 500, not a lot of joy there. Now, at Mount Dryden, there was an interesting rock package that wasn't at Stavely, and it's important. Ross talked about the importance of bonanites and how they can only form when a slab first subducts, it's wet and hydrated, and it plunges down into the super hot mantle that immediately starts to chill because the wet slabs arrive. That can bleed out one extra burst of melt from those rocks that you wouldn't normally get because of the flux, the water fluxing the melt. And so you'll get a bonanite, and then really you shouldn't be getting any more melt out of the rock. What happens is, of course, sediment's coming down and you get the mantle corner flow bringing in new mantle, so it refertilises and then will mature to a steady state calcalkaline system. Given that model, even though we can't date the bonanites because they're very mafic, you have to put them down as older than these two. So older than 500. So the new drilling program, the main aim was we got these volcanics, very limited geochem and geocron. Let's drill all the belts, and some of them we haven't drilled because there's actually exploration drilling by other companies in these, so we're not going to drill their rocks again, but we did spend money resampling with newer geochem on those rocks. So we built up a bigger geocron and geochem database to see how all these belts relate to each other. And you can see where we spent a lot of money. Here's the Stavely Arc complex. This is the basement sandwich with the 2 quartz sandstones either side, and we basically spent most of our time drilling into the arc, because that's the main thing we're after, and doing some testing of where the margins would be. And what we found here was a bit more diversity. We found, as well as basaltic andesite, some almost morblite basalts in the drilling. And we did more dating. Chris will talk about this later, but the interesting thing is we got a 510 age out of one of the mafic ones, so maybe the mafic one's older than the more felsic part of the package, but no, we also got a more felsic rock with an old age as well. So I still haven't really sorted out whether it goes basalt, andesite, or whether it's andesite, basalt in terms of an evolution, but at least we've extended the age of the arc over at least 10 million years, and as Ross was saying, from regional constraints, it potentially goes back even to 525. We also dated the Bushy Creeks again that look from field relationships to be younger, but they still overlap. But from field relationships, we know it must be younger, but incredibly tightly. For the first time, we dated the mineralisation itself by doing rhenium osmium on molybdenite, and we also dated the porphyries themselves, for the mineralised porphyries, for the first time ever. This old date here was me learning how to breach all the protocols around doing rhenium osmium, and so we did some more, but we couldn't do the same sample again because it used up all the material. But what we managed to do was date the host rock that it came out of, and it turned out to be a little bit younger, suggesting that age there isn't really valid. And the last thing we did, and so that was the host rock related to that porphyry that's actually part of the volcanics, and There's also, what we can see now is with the new spread of ages is they still overlap. The Bushy Creek granites, which we know are late from field mapping, are overlapping in age with the volcanics, but they sort of look like they could be a little bit younger, but it's not statistically significant. Now, the importance of trying to tease out all those ages is what is the relationship of the porphyries to the Bushy Creeks and the Stavely volcanics. So this is the late granites, so just coming up as circular blobs, and these are the volcanic belts that must have been folded earlier on end. Well, the academics have helped us here again in the mid-2000s, Melbourne Uni geochemists. They were interested in the relationship between the granites and the volcanic belts because they're essentially in the same place at the same time. So they did some geochemistry on them, colour-coded blue and green, and they're petrogenically related. They've got the subduction signature, and it's basically lying together on a fractionation trend. So that's what the academics did. So what we just did was went down our core shed, grabbed some of the mineralised porphyry, the least altered stuff, so the geochemistry would hang together, and we fed it through the same lab. So you've got the same people doing the same thing, so you're comparing apples with apples. And when you plot up the geochemistry of the mineralised porphyry, the only one we could get samples from we'd kept was Thursday's Gossan. So we haven't done all three, only this one. And when you plot up where they lie, they're actually sitting looking like they're associated with the Bushy Creeks rather than the Staveleys. And that's really important because it means the porphyry mineralisation, that could be the big bulk mining targets, can potentially be anywhere across the zone rather than narrowly restricted to these belts. This was the previous data. We've got a whole stack more geochemistry we'll talk about today, and as you collect more geochemistry, the pictures actually become more murky rather than more clear. The curse of having too much data, perhaps. So as I just said, the fact that the porphyries can never be is a bit game-changing in terms of the prospectivity because the search space is now huge. The volcanic belts are only a few % of the whole Stavely zone, so there's a huge increase in where you can search for the porphyries. If you want to look for the VHMS, it's probably going to be associated with the belt still. So when the belts are folded up on end, because we're not quite clear of the spacing, if you've got a porphyry system, but you don't know which way it's facing, it's hard to know which way to vector. And also because the belts are fault sliced to the surface, you could potentially be slicing through your porphyry and the really good potassic core could be missing if you're trying to vector onto it. Or the erosion level could be down here and you've got some distal alteration and you drill down expecting to find a potassic core, but it's actually been thrust above you and gone now. And it's all restricted to a few tight belts. Having the porphyries as part of these late intrusions can come up anywhere is much better for exploration because the facing of the belts is irrelevant because the porphyries don't have anything to do with them. When you vector down, you're basically just looking down like in a modern system onto them, although do beware because they're 500 million years old and there's a lot of late faulting, even if you find the deposit, it's still going to be cut and displaced by faults. But in terms of the overall vector, down's still going to be heading where it's good. They can occur right across the zone. That's about a 20 times increase in the search space. Okay, so that's the bedrock. That's the main target you want to be looking for. So I've just got to cover off on some of the cover sequences before we get our own sandwiches. This is the Grampians. It's a red bed cover sequence. As I said, it's hard rock, so you can think you're in the bedrock drilling into it, but it's not. It sticks out of the ground. It's so hard and makes the Grampian Ranges National Park. There's three sequences. There's a lower sandstone, which tends to be sort of pebbly fluvial material. There's a middle mudstone, which, because it's soft, is carved out as the main valley, sort of shallow marine tidal, ripples and mud cracks on it. And then there's an upper sandstone that's shallow marine and in cases becomes subaerial, and here's like big dune cross bedding. If you're going to be exploring hard to recognise rocks in drill core, see what they look like in outcrop first so you recognise it in the drill core. You can convince your exploration boss to let you go for a few walks in the national park so that when you look at your drill core you'll understand what it looks like. The granites. So this is one of the Devonian granites, the Mafeking Goldfield 1900. It's burnt sort of a circular intrusion hole inside the Grampian Ranges. There's little veinlets with gold and some base metal associated with them were concentrated into alluvials that they mainly mined. So you're beginning getting geochem signals coming from these Devonian granites, intruding through the whole region, not just in the Grampians, but also outside the Grampians. Remember that the orientations can tell you which granites you're potentially in, and you can even date them nowadays, that's good. Now, as well as being granites, to the west of the Grampians, some of the granites actually made to the surface and erupted as what we call the Rockland volcanics, and they're sort of sitting out as a blanket on the surface, and they've got geochem anomalies people have been chasing up as well amongst them. That's all for the Grampians. The Cenozoic rocks, as I said, they're unconsolidated. They can be an impediment to geochem exploration. This has just been tried. These same rocks cover the Stall zone just to the east, and Stall was looking at the geochemistry expression with CSLM coming up through the surface, and it doesn't make it through to the surface. But what happens is, because it's also regional groundwater aquifers, there's the potential of looking at groundwater plumes dispersing in geochemistry there, and there's a talk later this afternoon because we tried to do some of that work. I can't show you any photo of these rocks because they simply don't outcrop. All they do is occur in drill core. If you want to get a better understanding of them, go to the Blue Bible on the Murray Basin. Everything you're afraid to ask about them's in this book. Campbell Brown gave his life in the making of this book when he effectively decapitated himself in a high-speed vehicle rollover. So I treasure the book. And effectively we have that sandstone sandwich was formed is in the initial phases. There's the lower Renmark group is a fluvial system flowing out to the sea. The sea transgresses and overruns the fluvial system, and then the sea retreats and you have a shallow marine sort of beach system followed up by rivers and back beach environment following back over the sea again as it disappears. And we'll see some of these rocks down to core shed tomorrow because that's the only way you can see them in core. And where we're drilling in the Stavely area, we tend to be about here on the transition of the maximum marine extent. So you'll be drilling down not into the pure limestones that exist here, which will be further out to the northwest, but into these sort of dirty carbonaceous tidal marginal marine units, which can be geochemical traps. Now, the last thing is I've just been talking about the Murray Basin stratigraphy. The Murray Basin occurs in the north here, but you can see the cover swings right around to the south. And in the south, it's the same sort of shallow marine sequence with that transgression coming on board, but it's called the Otway Basin. And overlying the Otway Basin in the south is the newer volcanics basalts. That's the garnish on our last sandwich here, only in the south. And that's about 30 metres of young basalts, 5 million years down to about 40,000 years. They've erupted and they're just lying flatly across the already flat shallow marine surface. They can be hard to drill through. Some people's air cores have refused in the past and they tend to blur out the magnetics a bit. Now, the marginal marine does become deep marine. Beware where you're drilling. As you step off the edge, Antarctica used to be down here and it got ripped apart in the Cretaceous, and there's a huge hole that goes right through to the ocean. It's infilled with sediment. Petroleum companies at their expense rather than yours have already drilled a series of holes along the margin. All these holes intersect basement at greater than 1,000 metres. So if you're looking for primary hard rock mineralisation, that's probably a tad too deep. This boundary is built into the 3D model. So just lastly, in wrapping up the implications for exploration, the great thing is there's already been one VHMS deposit, Wycliffe, found inside the belt, and Thursday Gossan. So we have a type locality deposit for the two main types you'd be likely chasing. The footprints of what they look like in geophysics was already written up about almost 20 years ago now by the Geological Survey. So the massive sulphides, because the belts were originally on the seafloor as a volcanic arc with horizontal massive sulphides and now been flipped up on end by the faulting. You get northwest striking, dipping IP anomalies restricted to the belts, and there's some difficulty here because you've got conductive clays in the surface and saline groundwater. Thursday's Gossan, it's a magnetic blob. Some of them have phyllic overprint that's destroyed the magnetite, so they're demag zones. Some of them are potassic with the magnetite still in place, so they're magnetic anomalies. There tends to be a gravity low associated with them because there's more fracturing over the top of the porphyries with all their veins, so the groundwater's got down deeper into them and it's also turned acid. So there's deeper weathering that makes it less dense and gives a gravity low, and there's also an electrical anomaly that could be the sulphides or the saline groundwater. So given the footprints are known and how we've got this better understanding of the rock units, all we can say is there's multiple cover sequences that can be confusing with the basement or concealing it. So that's the Grampian sandwich and the Murray Basin sandwich. The geochemistry shows that all the volcanic belts were part of the same arc system, and so therefore they're all prospective for VHMS. When you look at the modern fertility with some of your sort of trace element stuff, it tends to suggest the mafic parts of the belt would be more fertile for VHMS, and of course they'll be more magnetic and show up easier through the younger cover. So that's a good alignment there. And the porphyries seem to be later and can be anywhere, but to get a porphyry, you tend to want to have a batholith that's been fractionated and coming off nearby. So when you're looking across the map area, if you're looking for porphyries, probably best to make sure you've got some batholiths nearby to be the feedstock for them. And there's too many round blobs on the map for a whole stack of other reasons. There's like Murray, there's young volcanic plugs and all sorts of things. So you can't drill all them, you'd go broke. But we know from the geophysical footprints that there's going to be a gravity and then an EM signature as gateway processes before you decide to launch into expensive drilling for those. So that's my conclusions. Thank you.